Guerrilla warfare has been around for a very long time. In fact, it's almost as old as war itself. But there's one guerrilla war in particular that stands out above all others as being the most famous of the 20th century. And it's this war that will be discussed today. It was a war where an extremely powerful nation went to great lengths to try and defeat a determined insurgency. It was also a war which resulted in the end of an era. I am of course talking about the Vietnam War. So today, we shall be discussing the Vietnam War, the most famous guerrilla war of the 20th century. If you enjoy this video and want to see more just like it, then be sure to hit that subscribe button. The Vietnam War was fought between 1955 and 1975, and was essentially the Second Indochina War, the first being the First Indochina War fought between 1946 and 1954 between the French colonial forces and the Viet Minh, which was a communist-led coalition of various Vietnamese independence organizations. The First Indochina War ended with the Geneva Accords, which temporarily divided Vietnam into the Communist North and the US-backed South. This is when the Americans became involved. The US feared the spread of communism throughout Southeast Asia, and so decided to support the government of South Vietnam. However, there were several problems with this. Firstly, the US didn't really have much of an understanding of Vietnamese culture or people. And secondly, the US-backed leader of South Vietnam, Ngo Dinh Diem, turned out to be a bit of a dick. Diem had previously supported the French colonial regime and wasn't exactly keen on giving power to the Vietnamese people. He ruled like a god over his people, suppressing any opposition to his regime, including from Buddhist monks who made up around 90% of the population. In response to the oppression by the regime, a nationalist and communist movement known as the Viet Cong, or VC for short, began to emerge. The VC used guerrilla tactics to attack Diem's regime. This included ambushing his soldiers, destroying his infrastructure, and assassinating his officials. Then in 1963, things got a little more complicated because the US was involved now. When Diem refused to hold elections as outlined in the Geneva Accords, the NLF, or the National Liberation Front, which was another name for the Viet Cong, launched an offensive against him with the support of North Vietnam. The US sent military aid in order to help prop up Diem's regime. But he was eventually overthrown and assassinated in a coup backed by the CIA. But despite the change in leadership, the VC continued their fight against the US and their allies, which led the US to increase its involvement in the conflict. By 1965, they were fully committed to fighting the war. They sent over 200,000 troops to fight against the VC. Despite being vastly outnumbered, the VC were proving to be very effective in the jungle warfare that was taking place in southern Vietnam. They knew the terrain like the back of their hands and used it to their advantage. Their tactics included hit-and-run missions where they would launch a surprise attack and then melt away into the jungle before reinforcements could arrive. They would often use booby traps, snipers, and disguises in order to catch their enemy off guard. Additionally, the VC had the support of the local population who saw them as liberators from the oppressive regime. This meant that the VC had access to food, intelligence, and shelter, all of which helped them to survive in the harsh jungle environment. On top of all of this, the VC were well-trained and disciplined. Many of them had received military training in North Vietnam or from Chinese and Soviet advisors. This meant that they were able to hold their own against the US soldiers who were often poorly trained and inexperienced in jungle warfare. The VC's greatest victory came in 1968 during the Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive was a series of attacks launched by North Vietnam and the VC across South Vietnam. The offensive caught the US and South Vietnamese forces by surprise, and they were initially very effective. The VC seized several key targets, including the US Embassy in Saigon. However, the offensive eventually failed due to the sheer firepower of the US military. But it was still a major blow to the US and had a major impact on the war. It showed that the US could not win a war of attrition against the VC, and it also had a major impact on public opinion in the US. The American people began to question the war and whether it was worth the high number of casualties. As the war dragged on, the US became increasingly desperate to find a way to defeat the VC. They tried new tactics, new weapons, and even chemical warfare, but nothing worked. In the end, the US pulled out of Vietnam in 1973. The war officially ended in 1975 with the fall of Saigon. The Vietnam War was one of the longest and most costly conflicts in US history. It involved over 58,000 US service members and 2 million Vietnamese service members. The war also had a major impact on the world. It was the longest war of the Cold War, and it marked the end of the American era of dominance. It also led to the rise of communism in Southeast Asia. There are many reasons why the VC were able to win the war. One reason was their use of guerrilla tactics. As we've already discussed, these tactics were highly effective in the jungle environment of Vietnam. Another reason was the support of the local population. This gave the VC access to food, intelligence, and shelter, all of which were essential for their survival. Finally, the VC were well-trained and disciplined, which allowed them to hold their own against the US military. But what about the US? Why did they lose the war? There are many reasons. One reason was that the US did not understand the Vietnamese people or culture. This led to a lack of support from the local population. Additionally, the US was fighting a war of attrition, and they simply could not match the VC in this regard. Finally, the US was bogged down by its own bureaucracy, and this made it difficult to effectively fight the VC. So there we have it, the Vietnam War, the most famous guerrilla war of the 20th century. If you enjoyed this video, then be sure to hit that subscribe button. Thanks for watching.